Word. Awesome. So hi, everyone. Welcome to How to Go from Zero to Hero with your grant strategy in under 60 minutes. It'll actually be in under probably about 45 minutes. So this is a special workshop just with Civic Champ subscribers. So I'm really glad you're here. As Gang mentioned, this is recorded. So we will share all these slides and the recording with you after if you want to share it with someone else. If you want to just review it later, that's up to you. And we love questions. I love questions. So please drop them in the chat at any time. If they're sort of able to get to, we'll get to them in the presentation. Otherwise, we'll get to them all at the end. But yeah, so let's hop into it. So who am I and kind of why am I here? So I'm Celia, as Gang mentioned. Instrumentl and Civic Champs have a great partnership, and we wanted to kind of share what we know about grants with you all today. So I run partnerships for Instrumentl and I lead special webinars like this. We do regular webinars on all kinds of grant and sort of nonprofit fundraising related topics. So you can definitely check those out if you're interested. But essentially what we're doing is we're looking at a problem that your grant professionals and nonprofits are trying to solve. And we're going to share some different processes, some tools, some systems, kind of some frameworks to think about those and to tackle them. So a little bit of background, if you've never heard of Instrumentl before, we are the institutional fundraising platform. So we bring grant prospecting, tracking, and management all under one roof. We help more than 2,000 nonprofits win more grants and do less at the same time. And so what that means is that every day we are talking to nonprofits about what blocks them from their achieving their grant seeking goals. And so this presentation is a little bit of a response to that. So hopefully you will find some things in here. So before I get started, I want to know if any of this resonates with you. So drop an emoji in the chat if you feel like this applies to you, but maybe you feel a little bit ill prepared in your organization for the ability to consistently find good fit funders and apply for grants. So if that's you, I want to hear from you. Drop a little emoji in the chat. Or maybe you feel a little bit, a little bit overwhelmed by maybe all of the things that you have to do, right? You think about grants, it sounds great, but then you realize you've got to find the opportunity. You've got to vet the opportunity. You've got to see what bandwidth you actually apply. Yep, there we go. We got somebody who's definitely feels me on this. And then you actually have to write it and apply, right? And then you have to do all the reporting. So it can be a little bit overwhelming, right? Or maybe none of this is you and you're really excited about grants, but you sit down at the computer ready to write and you just feel writer's block. You just have no idea where to start. You see that blank screen and you're like, let me go do anything else, right? And so, whatever it is, you shouldn't feel alone. You can see in the chat, there's a couple of people who agree, right? You shouldn't feel alone. This is very common. But this may sort of leave you feeling like, are grants really worth the effort? Maybe we just walk away from them altogether. And what I really want to start with today is the answer is absolutely grants are worth the effort. And the reason for that is there are so many opportunities out there, regardless of kind of what you're focused on, right? So there's more than 87,000 grant makers out there. And that just goes to show you at like a macro level, there's so much opportunity, kind of regardless of what you're focused on, right? So regardless of your kind of area of expertise or your kind of focus with funding, right? There's opportunities out there for you. We've got 12,000, this actually needs to be updated. We've got 12,000 plus opportunities on Instrumentl alone. We add a couple hundred a week, right? So we're seeing this all the time. We're seeing new opportunities all the time. Something else to note is that times have been rough, right? This year, the last couple of years have been a little hard. And I think the result of that has been that nonprofits kind of feel the pinch sometimes. So, some stats here, like 49% of nonprofit employees were sort of expecting some cost cuts in 2021. And then we have also seen a little bit of a drop in individual giving campaign over the last few years. But the good news is that foundation giving is actually up. And this is important because this really underpins the need to have a diverse fundraising strategy, right? Remember that old saying, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. We want to think about that when it comes to fundraising for our nonprofits as well. Individual donor campaigns are fantastic, but we also want to make sure that we are thinking about other ways to kind of supplement that, and grants are a fantastic way to do that. So whether you're new to nonprofits or you're new to grants as a way to diversify, or maybe you've been doing grants a long time and you see the need to kind of get quicker, we are just going to talk about some key ways to kind of dial that in. Sarah says she's done grants with other organizations, but under new management, they are looking they're looking at grants. So that's awesome, Sarah. I'm glad you're here. Hopefully you find something helpful here. So where are we going today, right? So in the next 40 minutes or so, we are going to explore some helpful ways to really think about this problem, right? We're going to talk about why are grants powerful? What we're going to talk about, what is prospect research? Why are we doing it? And how do we think about it? I'm going to touch on some really important questions that you can kind of think through as you're evaluating opportunities. And then we're going to talk about how you can prepare your organization for success. And then finally, I am going to show all of you how you can start using Instrumentl today if you want to. Today, everyone on this call is going to have access to use Instrumentl for 14 days for free. So if you're thinking about grants and you're just trying to figure out what are some good opportunities, you can definitely find some good opportunities today. You can use Instrumentl beyond that 14 days if you're interested, or you can take those opportunities and work on them on your own. But either way, we're going to go through some really great frameworks on thinking about, grant funding. Whoa, my computer is hopping all around today. Here we go. Okay, and you'll definitely want to stay with me because at the end, I am going to give away a 40-page resource that we have that's really going to help you think about prospect research as you hop deeper into grant funding. So definitely stick with me. All right, so first things first, why are grants powerful? Why do we care? There seems to be a lot of people here who are newer to grants or maybe newer to grants within their organization. So something to think about here, grants are awesome. And one of the first reasons I love grants is they are really broad in their application, right? Depending on what it is specifically that you're kind of needing to fund, grants can be really broad or they can be really specific. And why that's helpful is if you are an organization like, and we've got lots of Habitat for Humanity, lots of Humane Society organizations with us here today. So if you are an organization that's working with animals, maybe you need general funding. Maybe you just need dollars through the door to be able to keep the lights on. Or maybe you have a really specific thing that you're working on. Maybe you are sort of building out some additional kennels or something like that. And so you need some funding for a really specific project. With grant funding, you can get really granular and we can say we need funding for building out kennels. And all of a sudden now we have tapped into a whole field of grant opportunities that are less competitive because they're very specific in their purpose, right? Some kind of capacity building or capital project, right? So as we think about this, because we are going to talk about finding good fit funders at the end, just kind of make a little bit of a mental note. Where do you think you need funding? You know, and as you look at this list, where do you think you need funding? Is it education programs? Is it capacity building? Is it just general? Is it just, you know what, we need to be able to pay our electric bill, right? Think about those kind of things as we kind of move through it. The next reason I love grants is because foundations have to give, right? We are entering a little bit of an uncertain economic moment, right? We are sort of entering this like maybe recession period of time. And what that means is that sometimes individual donors are going to kind of like tighten up. But foundations are required to give. So there's a rule, the minimum distribution rule, that says that foundations are required to give away at least 5% of their total net assets annually. The vast majority of that goes to grants. There's some administrative expenses that are included in there too, but the vast majority of that is going to grants. And so that means that even as we enter some uncertain economic moments, we still have this source that is sort of required to give. And so we want to think about that too. To kind of highlight that, this is a screenshot from within Instrumentl, but here we are, we're looking at the total assets of New York Community Trust. Their total assets are 2.9 billion. If we multiply that by 5%, we can see that they're required to give $146 million every year. So this really sort of underpins what's available out there, right? The next reason that I love and habitat, yes, of course. The next reason that I love grants is because foundations are really consistent in their giving. Once you develop a relationship with some of these foundations, you can somewhat rely on that. And I'll show you as we get into it, but one of the things we're going to want to ask and understand is what percentage of these grants are going to new grantees versus repeat grantees. And that's going to help me understand what kind of long-term relationship I can build with this partner, because if I can consistently hit impact, consistently do my reporting, I can sort of I can get to a place where now I can kind of count on the funding from this foundation. And that's going to allow me to really grow as an organization and sort of plan down the road, right? The next reason is that we can systematize the grant process, right? There are these steps to writing a grant that we can really develop a process around. And what does that mean? Well, we're here. You guys are all here because you work with Civic Champs. So volunteers are going to be sort of a key part of what you do. If you have a process around grants, it's much more easy to kind of plug a volunteer in and say, hey, you know what? We know exactly how we prospect grants. I'm going to give this to a volunteer with really clear documentation. And now all of a sudden I've got that whole thing kind of getting worked on for me, right? So grants allow us to create a process. And we'll talk about the importance of a process here in a minute. And then finally, grants allow for accountability. I want you to think about maybe if you've ever done a donor campaign, you do all this prep, maybe you throw a gala, you raise a bunch of money, and then what? Right? Most of those people that came to your gala and donated are not asking for some kind of regular reporting. They're not asking for some kind of impact. And so we are not necessarily as an organization then going to prioritize figuring out how efficient are we with that money? Did we actually accomplish what we wanted to accomplish with those funds? Grants, on the other hand, require some reporting, which means thinking about that from an operational and sort of organizational perspective. You know, what are we doing with this money? Are we moving the needle? Are we moving towards our overarching mission and goal as an organization? And grants just allow you to have that kind of feedback loop, right? Okay, so we've talked about why grants are important. So we'll sort of we'll keep talking about this a little bit more, and I do see your questions. I will get to them. But now I want to kind of switch gears slightly and talk a little bit about what prospect research is, right? Because prospect research is really the process of finding and qualifying, assessing and qualifying grant opportunities. And so we think about the grant life cycle. It's kind of a pinwheel, right? It's a flywheel. It kind of throws itself around. And we're really talking about this bottom right corner, this kind of greenish yellow arrow here, which is finding your funding. And so as you're starting to work on programs, we really want to be looking at ways to find funding. And that's where we are with prospecting, right? So with a good prospect research system, organizations can get away from being so reactive. And instead, we can kind of create this steady influx of funds so that we can focus on work. We can sort of stress less. And we know where these funds are coming from. So we kind of want to think about that full life cycle. But today, we're just going to focus on prospect research. And why is prospect research important? Well, I really like this quote. It's from Network for Good, but essentially Network for Good did some studies, and what they found is that 40% of donors admitted that they could be giving more than they were, but they just didn't know who to give it to. They weren't finding the opportunities to actually fund. And what that means is that as a nonprofit, as an organization that needs funding, it sort of falls to us to move funders up into greater levels of giving. An example that I really kind of love to kind of highlight here. We had a client a few years ago, and this client had been a volunteer for a long time with a sort of mega sort of foundation nonprofit. 10 years they'd been volunteering with this organization. And after about 10 years, this client of ours decided to go out on their own and start their own nonprofit. So they came to us, they were looking for funding. They came to us, and almost immediately what they found was that there was funding available at that organization they had volunteered at for 10 years. And they had no idea. They'd spent 10 years there, and they had no idea that that organization even did grants, right? And then once they started looking, they realized they had a connection to, the executive director over there, and they were able to get that grant. And so this just really underpins the importance of like turning over those rocks. Like, are we actually looking in the right places for these opportunities? Because what this quote, what we've learned from Network for Good here is that there are plenty of foundations out there that want to give. They just don't know who to give to. And so it is our job as nonprofits to really do that digging, do that prospect research in order to find the best opportunities for our organization. All right, so we've talked about, why grants are important. We've talked about what prospect research is and what do we care, why do we care about that? And that's all great, right? So we know we need to prospect. But now the question is, what is available? What information do we actually need to have in order to make a decision? And there's a lot of information out there. I feel like a lot of the time I'm talking to people who just aren't sure what's important or relevant. So on this slide, I've pulled out a couple of points that I think are important. I want to say, though, that it's going to depend on your organization. And what I will sort of challenge you with today is start small. If you've never done this before, think about maybe 3 to 5 sort of categories or questions that are really important to you that you want to make sure you get answered. And as you kind of get more familiar, maybe that's 7 questions all the way, up to maybe 15 questions, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about how you design something like that in a minute. But some of the key questions we want to ask, we want to first know, we want to understand the statistics around the assets and the giving patterns, right? So we'll notice, for example, we looked at assets and we talked about that 5% minimum distribution rule, right? But you can look at that over a longer time horizon, right? So whenever we can look at multi-year data, we're going to have a much clearer perspective on what is this foundation about? Do they put their money where their mouth is? If any of you are familiar with grants, you know that you've read an RFP that is very vague and you may leave being like, I have no idea what this organization does, right? And so we want to dig a little bit deeper into their past giving behavior. What are they giving to and how much? We also want to look at the names of key individuals. Do we know any of these people? I will show you how to do this in Instrumentl, but I like to find key people in the 990 data, which is a public tax document, right? That all foundations are required to produce. I like to find those key people, and I like to send all those names to my board and say, hey, do you know anybody? Or maybe you send them to your volunteers and see if they know anybody, right? But we're looking for opportunities to make those connections. And the first place to start is obviously to understand who those people are. We also want to look at giving trends and cycles like over the year, right? So again, we're talking about that multi-year trend. So when I work with development people on prospecting, what I often tell them is to really look at past grantees and find out what projects were funded specifically, right? And the type of funding, right? So remember we were talking about kind of the broad possibilities that we could do with grants, whether that's general operating expenses or capacity building or education. I want to understand, has this funder given to specific purposes like mine? Like, does this funder fund general operating expenses, or do they only fund specific projects? And that's going to really help inform whether or not this is an opportunity I want to prioritize, or maybe it's an opportunity I throw in the, long shot bin. And whenever I find, a free week, maybe I spend some time on that, right? And then the final thing is we want to think about geographic focus, right? Some organizations, most organizations have some kind of geographic focus. So if you're in Texas, but you're looking at a foundation that really focuses on California, that might not be a good fit. And the goal here is, with all of these questions, where we're going is we're trying to move away from like getting that square peg into that round hole, right? Like we want to move away from that. If it doesn't fit, we're moving on. We're just going to keep it moving. There's plenty of opportunities out there. We're not going to force things. And so we want to ask these questions to really help us understand, like, I'm a round peg. Is that a square hole or is it a round hole, right? Like that's what we're trying to figure out. Bye, Jeremiah. There'll be a recording sent to you. No worries. Hope everything's okay. All right. So these are just a couple of things to think about as we kind of get more familiar. You'll figure out what makes sense for your organization in terms of the questions to ask. But the point here is we really just want to pull out a couple pieces of key data, which will help us to really quickly make those decisions and keep moving, right? I'm going to zoom through this just for the sake of time, but this is kind of what it looks like on Instrumentl. Like I was showing you the geographic focus, and we can talk about all that later. And definitely stick with me because that document that I was telling you about that I'm giving away at the end has 16 questions. So some of these questions we just talked about, we have a whole bunch of other questions that you can look at, and that might help jog some ideas for you all. So stick with me till the end. All right, so we've talked about why grants are important. We've talked about prospect research. We've talked about some key questions to ask in that process of prospect research. Now I kind of want to talk about like, how do we do this? So how are we going to prepare ourselves to actually begin bringing in grants? Like, let's talk about the nitty gritty and the tactical, like, how do we do this? But before I get in that, I really like to share this quote because I think that as we're thinking about grants, I really want to encourage people to think about systems. So the quote says, "You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. Your goal is your desired outcome. Your system is the collection of daily habits that will get you there." So if anyone's ever read this book, drop it in the chat. I'd love to hear from you. It's a great book, Atomic Habits by James Clear. But essentially, this is important because, a lot of times I talk to development directors or grant writers, and they say something like, our goal is to 2x grant funding. And I ask them, okay, what are you doing to get there? And they're like, I don't know, we just want to 2x our grant funding. And that's just not a great place to start, right? Because there's really no way to know if that goal is realistic or if it's totally arbitrary. And so we want to put some steps in place so that we can really understand, like, what is the process here, right? And this is the thing, it's hard to track a result when you have no process. So we want to be able to say, if someone comes to us and says, hey, how are we going on that 2x goal? We want to say, well, we're doing X, Y, and Z to get there, So as we hop into kind of preparing for grants, I just want you to keep in mind designing a system and a process is really going to help. And I don't want to be flippant about this. This is something that takes time. It does take a little bit of effort to kind of figure this out. But if we can start with a few little basic things, just carving out some time throughout the week to really sit down and say, okay, what's the process around this? How do I want to approach this? What's step 1? What's step 2? What's step 3? You're really going to set yourself up for a more long-term success when it comes to grant funding. All right, so how to prepare for grants. That's why we're all here, right? So how to prepare for grants. My first tip on how to prepare for grants, and don't feel like you need to jot all of this down, by the way, we are going to share slides, so no worries. But the first step is make sure you're discoverable. I cannot tell you how many times I've talked to nonprofits and I go to their website and it's like, one of those like coming soon websites, right? And it's such a miss because the funder, the grant maker is going to want to be able to validate that you're real. They're going to want to go to your website and see that what is on your website about your mission and sort of your goals is the same thing as what's in your application or your proposal, right? They want to understand, how are you measuring impact? What does that look like, right? And so if that's not clear, you need to redo your homepage. And the reason for that is things are going online. In 2021, I believe it was, The IRS actually required that everybody put all sort of private foundations put all their 990, all their tax data online. And so it's becoming more important to foundations to be able to really quickly and easily find you online and be able to validate that you are kind of real and you're doing what you say you're doing. The other thing is, putting detailed case studies if you have them, you're doing the work. Can you pull in some information on, hey, we did X, Y, and Z, and the outcome was, this. That's really going to help too, because that's really going to demonstrate to the foundation that you're doing what you say you're doing. So you definitely want to make sure that you are findable and that people sort of can validate that you're real and that you're working on the stuff that you say you're working on. My goodness, my computer is just hopping all around today. Okay. All right. So the next step is let's ask for help. Now I'm curious how many of you hate asking for help, because I find that in the nonprofit sector, a lot of people are maybe a little hesitant to ask for help. There's sort of this mentality of like, I can do it. It's all me. I got it. And I really want to just take a moment and tell you help is helpful. And so sometimes we just need to kind of ask, and our community, our board are great people to ask, right? So we want to kind of, as we're preparing, I want you to sort of ask your board about any suggestions that they might have on foundations that they're connected to, and start seeing if you can get any introductions from them. And you don't have to ask for funding off the bat, right? Like you can just ask for an introduction to a foundation for the purpose of just getting that introduction. Hey, I heard you make grants in this space. I heard you work in this space. We're working in this space. Like, let's connect. Like, I want to hear about what's important to you. What are you working on? Just start building those relationships, and you don't even have to ask for money, right? And that's going to help kind of like grease those wheels. We also want to think about starting really local. If you're brand new to grants, a lot of times sort of easy wins are going to be within local kind of local organizations that are a little less competitive, right? You're just competing with people in your city or your county versus, the whole country. And once we've gotten a couple of those local wins under our belt, now we've got some kind of template. We know what sort of works. We've written a couple proposals. We have success. I heard one grant teacher talk about grants as dominoes. We really want to kind of line them up so that they hit each other and fall. And we don't want to, win one grant and then sort of not use any momentum from that. We want to think about, okay, how do I win a local grant and sort of turn that into something bigger? So we want to start small, and then we can kind of expand. My next step for you is strategically outlining your fundraising strategy. So you're going to hear a bit of a theme throughout, which is design a process, design a system. This should be systematized. This is more science than art, although there is some art involved, right? But this is more science than art. So we really want to think about what is our strategy for fundraising. So here are some things to think about and maybe include in that strategy. So first, biggest resource needs. If you're looking for grant, the idea is that that's going to offset potentially needs for funding in other areas. So what are those funding needs and resources? Is it staff? Is it tech? Is it programming? What is it that you kind of need the funding for, right? From there, we want to think about goals and priorities, right? How does this funding push our sort of overarching organizational level kind of priorities and goals? From there, we're thinking about how are we tracking this, right? Because remember that wheel of the grant life cycle. Remember, this is sort of an ongoing process. This isn't one and done. We're sort of always moving that wheel around. So we need to think about things like reporting. How are we going to track? Who's going to track? How much bandwidth do we have for reporting, right? Those are things that are important, and designing a system around that too. How are we collecting that data? What are we doing with that data? That kind of thing. It's also going to tell us if what we're doing is helpful, right? So if we've spent all this time writing a grant and we got funding for a specific program, did it do anything? Did it help us achieve our mission, or was it a waste of time and energy and money, right? And so we want to think about how are we collecting and sort of assessing how successful that funding was. And then we want to think about the outcomes that we're going to be able to report, right? And we want to be really specific on this. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the concept of SMART objectives, but you should check it out. There's actually a really great blog up on the Instrumentl page with Dr. Bev Browning, who wrote Grant Writing for Dummies, I think is what it's called, but the Dummies book for grant writing. So SMART objectives with Dr. Bev Browning, check that out. But that is a really good way to kind of think about what we can track. And it's a good way to kind of reach for the moon, because if it's, if we don't want to reach for the moon if it's not plausible, right? We want to make sure that we have realistic goals. And then we want to think about, when are we going to report outcomes? Is there some kind of cadence here? Are we doing this quarterly? We want to collect data weekly and then report on it monthly. Like what is our sort of timing for this? What's realistic given the bandwidth of the organization? So that is, so our first step, remember, was make sure that you're findable. Our second step was to ask for help, right? Ask your board, ask your community, ask your volunteers for help. Our third step here was to make a plan, right? Outline your strategy. And so what might that look like? It might look like something like this, right? So where we've got kind of an idea of our fundraising sources, what we're doing with all of that funding in terms of how much have we gotten, how much is our goal, maybe a stretch goal, and then what can we do with that funding, right? So if I hit that stretch, what else can I do? Versus if I don't hit that stretch, what am I really going to focus on going forward, right? Cool. All right. My fourth step here is actually a tip. It's a pro tip. And that is to kind of think about your programs potentially as projects. So a lot of funders don't love, especially government funding, they get very specific about how you use funds. So when you're looking at like government grants, you may kind of need to get a little bit thoughtful about how you're presenting, because a lot of times these aren't available for just general operating expenses. So can we take sort of general operating, a program in general, and turn it into a project with a specific kind of timeline and outcome goal? So the example that I like to give, I was talking with an after-school tutoring program. They had an ongoing problem, or their ongoing problem, actually, I think it's here. Their ongoing problem was that they were really having a hard time finding funding for that general expenses that I was just mentioning. So if they positioned it as a clear project with a clear goal, then we're talking about fundraising for a specific project, right? And we can get a little bit more granular, be less competitive in what we're applying for. We can also be potentially more attractive to some of these grant funders. So instead of saying general, I'm going to be really specific and say, with this money, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, right? So maybe that's, I'm doubling the capacity of my weekly tutoring program, or I'm doing a reading drive. And so we've kind of put this timeline and this clear goal on it. We've taken it from being a nebulous program to being a really specific project. And that can really kind of help move the needle. So if you've tried doing grant funding in the past unsuccessfully, you might kind of look at, is there a way to reorient what you're asking for around more of a project and less of a general program? All right, and then step 5 is to create a weighted decision matrix. This is something that you're gonna have to figure out kind of what works for you. There's tons of decision matrices out there. We have a great workshop on our blog actually about decision matrices, and the document that I have available for you guys at the end here also talks a little bit about how to set one of those up. But they're gonna allow you to systematically think about whether it's a go or a no-go opportunity, right? And so things that we might want to include in our matrix, depending on our organization, are, is this aligned with our goals, or how aligned is it with our goals? What is the number of past grantees in my sort of geographic location? So if I'm in, Texas, do they focus on Texas, or are they funding in California? We also want to look at award amounts. So if I need $50,000 and one funder that I'm looking at does $20,000 grants and the other one does $500 grants, I'm probably going to focus on that former one, right? Because that's going to help me get there faster. So other things, and this is maybe the most important, is does my organization have the bandwidth for this? My pro tip, the longer the RFP, the more reporting requirements, right? So if you get this like mega RFP with all this stuff you got to go through, you can expect reporting is going to be just as complicated. And so we want to think about what can we realistically do internally to kind of get this set up. This is a great opportunity for volunteers. What is an RFP? That's a fantastic question. That is a request for proposal. So that is what the grant maker is putting out into the world. They're saying, hey, we've got money. We want to give it to you. Please send us a proposal for our funding. That's what an RFP is. Good question. Okay, cool. So like I said, stick with me. I'm going to share that go versus no go tool. It's got some really fun stuff in it. And it's a great way to kind of level up your grant process here. Cool. All right, so how to find good fit funders. So we've talked about why grants are important. We've talked about how we do prospect research and why we do prospect research. We've talked a little bit about what are some of the key questions that we want to ask. And then I've talked a little bit about how we prepare for grants, right? So first was we want to make sure we're findable. Then our second one was we want to make sure we're asking for help when we need it. The third one was to develop a system, right? To develop some kind of understanding of how this was all going to go. The fourth one was my pro tip around maybe moving from program thinking to project thinking. And then finally, our last step on how to prepare was to create a decision matrix that will help us, that will just kind of spit out a number once we've gone through it and tell us good opportunity, bad opportunity, right? So we've talked about how to prepare. Now I want to switch gears slightly and I want to show you guys how to find some good fit funders. And oops, my computer is hopping all around today. It's a little annoying. Okay, so how do we find this information? I mentioned at the top that there are 87,000 grant makers in the world, right? More than that, actually, plenty more than that. With all of that, how do we find them? And I think that if you're new to grants, you may find you may find that the prospecting part is maybe the most exhausting part, right? Because you start getting in there and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. So where do we look? Where are we going to look for this stuff? Well, I'm biased, but I think the best place to look is on Instrumentl. I'll show you why in a minute. But we can also look in Google. You can look in Google. You can look on ProPublica. You can look at GuideStar. There's other paid databases out there that will give you kind of everything. Some are a little bit more clunky than others. I would say you should look for databases that only present active opportunities. You may find when you're doing Google searches or on a thing like GuideStar that you're finding any foundation that's ever given a grant, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they have money or that they're planning on doing any grants anytime soon. So you want to think about active opportunities primarily. So that is that. And actually I would love to hear if there's any other places that you all like to look for grants, drop them in the chat. Sometimes that is encouraging and inspiring to other folks on the call of other places to look. So why do I love Instrumentl? Well, I think that the first one was that we only have active opportunities. So if it's in the, if you find it in your matches, then it's ready to be applied for. There's a date. We always include due dates on there. That includes a proposal as well as any other steps. Sometimes there's an LOI, that's a letter of intent that has to kind of go in first. So we've got all those dates lined up for you. We also, once you set up your project, our algorithm is just going to work in the background. So this is just going to be pulling from you all the time, sending you email updates. You can kind of set it and forget it and know that whenever you're ready for grants, you can come back in and there's going to be plenty of good fit opportunities for you. We also allow all this tracking, right? So all this collaboration, what we were talking about earlier on that system of, okay, so we've prospected it, maybe now we're writing, we've got to collect some data, right, from our program managers on, what actually happened, what can we actually say about this? That is all included within the platform so that we can see how all of that works together, right? And what does this mean? Well, it means that the people that use Instrumentl are saving about 3 hours a week on grants, as well as increasing their output by about 78% within the first year. So it can be really impactful. All right, so if you all are interested, what I would say is follow along with me here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how to take advantage of the 14 days free that we're providing to everybody today. You're also getting our standard plan, which is like a little bit of an extra. There's some really cool features in there that aren't typically available on some of our kind of lower tier plans. So follow along with me here. I'm going to show you how to do this. I'll show you how to set up your project. And what you will leave with today is a list of good fit funders that you can start working on immediately if you want to. So click on that link in the chat. It's going to take you into the website. You can hit click free trial and you're going to end up on this page that says that has you fill some stuff in. So go ahead and start doing that and then give me a thumbs up when you get there. And I'm going to kind of follow along with you here. I will give you some of my best practices on actually setting up setting up the search so that you're kind of getting the best possible stuff there. And I thought I had, there it is. Okay. Yeah, so that we make sure that you're sort of getting some actual good fits for you. So I'm Celia. I'm just going to enter my information in here now. And I'm just going to tell them a little bit about me. This is not how it's gonna, this is not as relevant for the project. So just do what you need to do here. But one thing to note, this platform is best for 501 US-based 501c3s with 90K or above in operating revenue. So if that's you, you should definitely follow along because we're going to find tons of good opportunities for you today. So I'm going to fill this out. I'm going to hit next. Oh, and I forgot to put my name in. There we go. And then it does not like me today for some reason. There we go. I'm just not reading. Cool. You will get to a page that looks like this. Go ahead and schedule a time because if you're going to get 14 days and you're going to use your 14 days, you might as well have an expert help you set up your project most optimally so you can get the most out of it. So you can schedule a time. This is a totally free call. You'll chat with one of our experts. They'll help you kind of get your project set up really well. So we're going to I'm going to skip it for the sake of time, but you all should find a time that works for you and put that on your calendar. And then I'm going to end up here. Would love to get like some thumbs up from folks that they're through and they're ready to move to the next part. And then I will kind of move on. But what we're going to do from here is I'm going to show you how to enter some information about your organization. And then you are going to get a list of really good opportunities that you can export, download, and start working on if you'd like, or just kind of start understanding like what this might look like for your organization. If you're not ready to necessarily do grants today, it's a good idea to kind of see what's out there. What are they going to ask of me? And how can I prepare my organization to get there at some point in the future? So go ahead and fill that out. I'm going to fill this out too. I'm going to tell them where I am. Like I mentioned before, I'm in Colorado. I'm going to do that. And then I'll tell them my fiscal year. And then this is actually the most important place. Let me know if you're behind. If you're not here yet, let me know and I'll wait for you. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep it moving here. So drop it in the chat if you're like, please, Celia, slow down. This is too fast. And I will slow down. But I'm going to use an organization that I volunteer with, which is a entrepreneurship program. We work with sort of small local businesses, primarily run by immigrants, and kind of help get them some training and also get some capital funding for their businesses as well. So I'm going to use that as my example. And then I like to think about the specific initiative within that organization that I'm working on. So I'm going to think about a curriculum development for this organization. I'm going to tell them I'm a nonprofit. If I was faith-based, I could say yes, and then I could click my faith, but that's not me today. So I'm going to hit no. And then when I get to project details, this is going to be one of the more important parts. So I'm going to tell them kind of where specifically I am located and where I'm working. I'm in Colorado, so I'm going to say everywhere in Colorado. And then we actually do some overlap with Wyoming from time to time. So I'm going to say everywhere in Wyoming as well. And then I'm going to select fields of work. And this is where I'm telling the algorithm specifically what it is that I'm kind of working on. If you're new to this, I would say browse, sort of pick some stuff out that feels good. There were a lot of humane societies in here today. There's lots of stuff on animal welfare. I also saw some Habitat for Humanity. Community services is a great one for that as well. Economic rights and justice is a big part. Entrepreneurship is a big part of what the organization I'm working with works on. And then we also do some education, some business education. Yeah. So I'm gonna choose 4. 3 to 7 is a good place to kind of start. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you for that heads up. And then I like to set a minimum. I think anything less than 1,000, sometimes not totally worth it. And then this is where we were talking about those kind of broad possibilities. So what do I need the funding for specifically? I'm always going to hit general operating expenses. Why not? And then there's education involved here. This is a program and probably some training and capacity building as well, right? If you're ever not clear, you just kind of scroll over these little I's and it'll give you more information. And I'm going to hit save and exit. I'm going to skip adding anyone to my team right now, but I can always do that later. All right, so I've got 222 foundation grants, 86 corporate grants, and 19 government grants that are available to me. So let's check them out, right? So this might look a little bit like an email inbox, and that's kind of what it is. These are all opportunities that are directly for you. But thinking about some of the questions we were asking earlier, how do we know if this is a good fit for us? Well, we can sort of scroll down here. We can review, what is it that they are working on? This supports organizations and projects that fit into these following grant categories. Okay, that looks like me. I can see their preferences. I can also see who's ineligible, right? So I can really quickly be like, am I any of these organizations? I'm not. That's great. So that means I'm potentially still eligible. From there, I can find out a little bit more. So that first tab really helped me understand what is the mission, what is the RFP, that's the request for proposal say, what does the organization say they want? And then once I get into the 990 section, I can actually see a little bit more detail about what the organization has done in the past, right? So not just what they say they're going to do, but what they have actually done. This is going to give me a clearer idea of who they actually are. So I can see their key people, but even better, I can see some information, not this one, they haven't updated their stuff. But I can see some other information about, let's find one. Got information in here for us. Yeah, here we go. I can see kind of how their median giving has changed over the years, right? So I can see, that their average sort of grant amount is around 6,300. The median is much lower, which probably means they're giving a lot of smaller grants. So it's a question of whether or not this is actually something that I would be interested in. You can also see the geographic location. Again, very little in Colorado. They're very focused in California, pretty focused on Texas and New York as well. So this might not be the best fit for me, but if I'm not sure, I can always check and see who specifically are they funding in Colorado, and are any of these organizations that I know and feel like I kind of fit. I can also see that they're funding for program, which is great, right? Then I can see openness to new grantees. We talked about this earlier about, how competitive is this and can I count on this as a funder in the future, right? So I'm not going to go into all the details, but the point here is that really quickly I'm able to assess, is this a good fit for me? And if I think it is a good fit for me, I can go ahead and save it into my tracker. And then once I go into my tracker, here's that opportunity I just saved. I can click on it. I can add some notes for my team. I can add a task. So if I've got somebody on my team and I'm like, hey, find out who in Colorado they've funded. And I can set a deadline for that. And I can say by the end of next week, they need to figure that out, right? And then I hit done. And so here my team has access to everything they need related to the grant, including all the information about the grant funder. So that's a little bit about how to use it. I know that was quick. So I will kind of hop back in here. I hope some of you were able to follow along with me on that. That link that's in the chat is still good. So feel free to use it. If you love Instrumentl, make sure that you use the Civic Champs, let's see if I can remember it, code to get $50 off your first month. Okay, so that was a lot. We got 5 minutes left. So what did we learn today? What did we talk about? We talked about, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. We talked about that grants are a great way to diversify funding, right? That we want to not have all of our eggs in one basket. We want to think about multiple sources. We've also talked about the 5 steps that we've reviewed to prepare for grants. Good to see you, Ashley. And we've also talked a little bit about how you can use Instrumentl to speed that process up. You may find as you kind of hop into it, the prospecting and finding funders can be a little bit of a drag sometimes. So using Instrumentl can really add some speed and clarity to what you're doing. So that's what we discussed. If you learned something new, we'd love to see you on another webinar in the future. We do these pretty regularly. You can check out what's coming up, but we've got a couple of really fun things. If you're new to grants, you might check out our fireside chat next week with Dr. Bev. She's going to talk about what is the role of a grant writer and how do you set those expectations with your team in a way that is productive and is still setting some boundaries, right? Okay. Last little bit, I promised you a freebie here, so you can grab that there. It is our ultimate go versus no-go RFP evaluation tool, which is a mouthful, is a lot to say. But essentially, it's going to give us give you all the 16 questions that we talked about, and then that way you can kind of keep moving. Sarah, I believe it's on this Civic Champs 50 is the answer to your question, Sarah. Okay, so that's it for me. Gung, I'm gonna sort of hand it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know most folks are on mute right now, so I'll just sort of do the applause on behalf of everyone. That was super awesome. Thank you for sharing all of that knowledge with us. So yeah, remember you get $50 off your first month with the code that you see on screen right here in the chat. And then for folks that want to learn more about Civic Champs itself, we also left our links here as well, and so you can book a demo with us or reach out with any questions that you might have, right? And I know there was a couple questions. And so if we go back, I think one person just had a quick question of what is an RFP?
Yeah, so we addressed that a little bit, but an RFP is a request for proposal. So the grant maker, when they've decided they have funds to give out, they put out an RFP, and that essentially just says, hey, we have funds, we want to give them, send us your proposal and we will review them, right? So the RFP is really what starts that grant process.
Awesome. And then I think someone had a question quite a ways back, which is, is there a way you can ask the foundation on whether they provide sustaining grants, or is there a way for you to tell whether these are one-time things, or any guidance there?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. First, you can always reach out to grant makers and ask. And I always encourage people to think about setting that relationship up early. And so sometimes, and actually there's a really great blog on our website about like what questions to ask, but sometimes we want to kind of like warm them up, and we might ask questions we actually already know the answers to, just as a way to like introduce ourselves. We might want to reach out and say, hey, we're really interested in the grant opportunity. We'd love to learn a little bit more about whether or not we'd be a good fit. And there's some great questions on that blog article on our website on how to do that. But so that's the first thing. You may not get an answer though. The other way is you want to look at repeat grantees versus new grantees. And I looked at that a little bit in Instrumentl. We do have a really easy way to see that because we're collecting all that data for you. But we want to look at what percentage of the grants are going to new grantees versus repeat grantees. You can do that through Instrumentl. If you want to do it manually, you will have to look at the 990 data over a couple of years and kind of pull that out and be like, oh, they gave to Habitat for Humanity in 2019 and 2020, but then they gave to this organization in 2021 that they'd never given before. So that requires a little bit more effort, but it's helpful to understand that. And my pro tip there is over 30% new grantees is really great. That means that it's not a super competitive opportunity and that you have a chance. So I would look at that's a nice sweet spot. 30 to 50% new grantees is a good spot to be in.
And then you also know that they will actually follow on in the future too.
Potentially, right? I mean, you still have to the reporting is going to be really important, and making sure that you are sort of hitting those reporting requirements and that you're demonstrating impact with those funds is going to be important. But yeah, assuming you can do all of that, if you've got that, if you're in that 30 to 50% range, you can probably consider that might be a long-term funding opportunity.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, any other questions from folks? Maybe I'll give folks just a little bit of another moment here to type. I know we're right here on the hour, but if there's no other questions, I just wanted to say thank you again to Celia and Instrumentl. You guys are awesome, and hopefully everyone here on this webinar got a ton of value. I certainly learned more about grant writing, and so yeah, thanks again, and we'll see everyone soon.
Cool. And keep an eye out for recordings and slides. They'll be coming out soon. Thanks, everybody.